Is it time for term limits? In 1799, when George Washington's supporters asked him to consider serving a third term as President of the United States, he declared, "Prudence on my part must arrest any attempt to introduce me into the chair of government." Even though some of his contemporaries advocated for lifetime appointment for presidents, Washington thought that government officials should not seek to gain unfair power. Only one president has been elected 4 terms, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected to a third term in 40 and a fourth term in 44. This departure from the rule worried some, and on March 21, 47, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, legally limiting the office of president to 2 4-year terms. Okay, the first paragraph is introducing the idea that presidential terms are limited to 2 terms, 2 4-year terms. Paragraph 2, presidential terms are clearly limited in the Constitution, but for people serving in Congress, this is not the case. Currently, members of the House who serve 2-year terms, senators who serve 6-year terms can run for re-election an unlimited number of times. Modern surveys conducted by multiple firms consistently show American citizens of a variety of backgrounds and political leanings approve of the idea of setting term limits for members of Congress. Okay, so the second paragraph is pointing out, well, presidents have term limits, but congressional members in the House and Senate do not. And now the American people, according to surveys, favor term limits. American citizens are not the only supporters of term limits for Congress. Even some members of Congress themselves have spoken out in support of this change. Former Senator Lieberman, upon retirement, suggested Congress might be healthier and less partisan, less rigid if it turned over more often. And term limits are one way to do that. Michael Olson and Joe Rogowski stated in their article, Legislative Term Limits and Polarization, that proponents of term limits argue that limiting the number of terms legislatures can serve in office would reduce the level of partisan conflict, encourage compromise and cooperation, and improve the quality of representation. Okay, so it's paragraph 3 telling us? It's basically saying that there are Congress members themselves who are in favor of term limits, and they list out the various benefits of term limits. Potential benefits of term limits, certainly. Paragraph 4, experienced politicians certainly can build on years of knowledge, but term limit supporters point out that career politicians may base key decisions on their own personal long-term goals. In the article Term Limitations, author Elizabeth Garrett states that under term limits, a careerist needs to move up the political opportunity structure to remain in elected office, blah, 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 available position. So what's paragraph 4 telling us? It's sort of setting up a counterpoint. Although long-term experienced politicians can build on their knowledge, contrasting that, but term limit supporters point out that they may essentially base their decisions on their own personal goals, implied, not necessarily representing the people. Paragraph 5. So far, what do we have? We have president has term limits. Congress has no term limits. American people favor the term limits for Congress. And we have a listing of all the positive points of having term limits. Paragraph 5. While challenging the career politician's path is seen as a benefit to term limit supporters, there is a possibility that a Congress mostly composed of newcomers could severely affect policymaking. Okay, while this is a contrasting transition. So while there are benefits potentially to term limits, there could be negatives here, right? It's possible that newcomers will severely, that is harshly, affect policymaking. Experienced politicians have a deep knowledge of congressional processes. Additional politicians who serve together for extended periods have a chance to develop trusting relationships. Molly Reynolds from the Brookings Institution, seriously, the Brookings Institution, says that members who are restricted by terms limits have neither the time nor the incentive to develop the relevant expertise they need to be good at their jobs. If members don't have that expertise, they're more likely to rely on outsiders, including lobbyists. In fact, so now we've got an emphasizing transition. So we've turned from the positives of term limits to potential negative cases in paragraph 5. It looks like paragraph 6 we're emphasizing. In fact, first-time politicians' susceptibility to lobbyists has been put to the test. Study revealed that term limits may increase the influence of lobbyists. Additionally, so we have an added point. We're probably going to talk more about the potential downsides of term limits. Those who oppose term limits maintain that turnover in Congress is sufficient. Again, the Brookings Institution notes that every decade, new members replace at least half the members of the House and the Senate. So half of them get 10 years in office, and the president at most can only have 8. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Still, the average length, so despite this additional point, still the average length of time in office has mushroomed. So now we're getting another counterexample yet again to the negative view of term limits. And this one says, well, still the average time in office is mushroomed. It used to be basically about 5 years. Now it's nearly doubled to almost 10 years. So far, this looks to be an attempt at a balanced, informative essay that questions whether we should have term limits. They start off with potential benefits of term limits. They give a counterexample and continue their case. Then they turn to listing some of the negative sides of term limits and give a quick counterexample again. And they finally conclude here with, should Congress pass a constitutional amendment to institute congressional term limits? It's undecided. Notice the question mark. That means, curiosity, confusion, or uncertainty. It's not a decided issue. We've seen pros and cons in this particular passage. Perhaps one day people will have a chance to vote on the issue. We have a table. Again, tables, graphs, figures always tell an idea. They have their own main ideas. What does this one say? It's the percentage of representatives and senators reelected at, I assume, any given election. And it used to be lower, so it's increased, in some cases dramatically. And it's increased, it looks like, to a level in both now the House and the Senate to about 90%, which means 9 out of 10 times the incumbent is going to keep their seat. And people might think normally, well, they're Democrats and Republicans at least, so it's probably a 50-50 transaction. But no, that's not the case, not even close. 90% reelection rate. Okay, I think we have a sense of the progression of ideas of the story here. We can see that it's an informative attempt to be a balanced view on the idea of term limits. The skim reading portion, the part I underlined, could tell the story itself. I could read just those lines. I'd have a pretty good understanding of the entire story idea. Note also how I tend to circle transition words. But, while, in fact, additionally, these all give a good sense of how the ideas are changing from paragraph to paragraph or even within paragraphs potentially. Keep note of that. These are important aspects for improving your comprehension.